He rolled through enemy turf in a wheelchair, talking slick like he was untouchable. A few blocks later, he was laid out. No second chances, no passes, but it didn't start there. That hit wasn't random. It was years in the making. Turf, pride, and a dice game going wrong set it off. And what came next? Let's just say South L.A. wasn't the same after that. Before things got bloody, before Bugsy, before Sergio, it was just neighborhood politics. South lost 13 and the Hoovers didn't start out enemies, but their roots, deep and complicated. South lost 13, a Mexican-American set, kicked off in the 1970s in South Central L.A. They claimed turf on both sides of the 110 freeway, a rare flex from Imperial Highway to 120th Street between Normandy and Figueroa. That stretch was theirs. Back in the day, a lot of their members went to Locke High School. That place was more than books. It was a recruiting ground. You were either banging or staying out the way. South lost shared parts of their turf with other gangs too. West of the freeway, they rubbed shoulders with the Devil Lane Bloods. East of the freeway, that was Broadway Gangster Crips territory. It was complicated. A lot of hood, politics, and the wrong glance could get you pressed. Meanwhile, the Hoovers, specifically the 112 Hoovers, aka the 11 Deuce Hoovers or Laylos, were holding down territory just a few blocks away. Another set, born in the mid-70s, Hoovers were a black gang that claimed a chunk between 110th and Imperial Highway from Normandy to Van Buren. That stretch was known for being hot, always something going down. The Hoovers weren't isolated. They were locked in tight with other Hoover sets, especially the 107 Hoovers, better known as the Cellos. These dudes were just north of them and moved like family. Early on, South Loss and the Hoovers weren't necessarily tripping on each other, but the proximity, that was always a time bomb. When two sets are that close, something always sparks off, and eventually it did, but we'll get to that. First, there were the schools, the hallways, the after-school spots, the first signs that the peace wouldn't last forever. Back in the mid to late 80s, South Loss and the 112 Hoovers weren't on full-blown war mode. They actually had a somewhat neutral relationship. Some older heads from both sides even used to hang out. They might have played ball together or ended up in the same schoolyard. The beef hadn't cooked up yet, not fully, but when two deep sets share blocks, all it takes is one disrespect, one bad move. The first signs came low-key, not headline stuff. It was schoolyard tension, hallway standoffs, after-school brawls. Both sides had members at Locke High and other schools in the area. Word started going around that some South Lost dudes were upset about Hoovers selling in their zone. That turf violation didn't sit right. And then came the stories. One name started getting mentioned more and more: Bugsy. Allegedly, Bugsy was a South Lost member who used a wheelchair, but that didn't stop him from being outside. Word is, he would roll through Hoover blocks, lock eyes with folks, and talk reckless, straight up instigating. Whether he was testing boundaries or just didn't care, it set a tone, a disrespectful one. The Hoovers, already catching heat from other sets like the Devil Lanes and the Raymonds, didn't like the extra pressure. At the time, they were dealing with multiple fronts. Some say they were stretched thin. Others say they were waiting for the right moment to respond. Meanwhile, South Lost was growing in numbers. By the late 80s, they were probably at their strongest. They weren't looking for peace. They were pushing lines. Bugsy's actions weren't just about him. They became a symbol, a preview of what was coming. That type of provocation wasn't going to be ignored forever. The streets were watching. It wouldn't be long before that tension turned into something way more permanent. And that something, it went down in 1989 at a dice game. By 1989, the peace was already wearing thin. Tensions between South Lost 13 and the 112 Hoovers were bubbling up daily. It wasn't just talk anymore, it was action. You had fights breaking out at schools, threats on the corners, and people getting pressed just for being on the wrong block. But what officially lit the match? A dice game that went sideways. The story goes like this. A few Hoovers were posted up shooting dice with a South Lost member known as Lil Man. They were in neutral territory, maybe trying to keep things cool, maybe just hoping to get lucky. But Lil Man wasn't having a good night. He was losing, and according to reports, he wasn't taking it well. At some point during the game, things got heated. Arguments broke out, money was missing, or maybe someone said the wrong thing. Depends who you ask. What's consistent in all versions is this. Lil Man pulled a piece. Witnesses said he flashed a gun, then opened fire. 2 Hoovers got hit in the head. Both died on the spot. No chance to run, no chance to talk it out. That shooting changed everything. The 112th Hoovers couldn't let it slide. It wasn't just about the money or the game, it was the principle. You come into their space, kill 2 of their people, and expect it to be over? Nah, that wasn't going to fly. After that, the war was no longer avoidable. South Lost 13 had made their move, and the Hoovers were going to respond. Everyone in South Central felt the shift. It wasn't safe to be in the wrong place anymore, and Lil Man's name was stamped in street history as the one who kicked it all off. A year after the dice game shooting, tensions were sky high. Everyone knew things were hot, but not everyone knew what would push it over the edge. That came in 1990 when Bugsy made one last roll through enemy turf. Bugsy, who had become a known figure in South Lost, was already infamous for rolling through Hoover blocks in his wheelchair and talking mess. He didn't pull back, didn't stay low. He wanted them to see him. He wanted them to know South Lost wasn't scared. And on this particular day, he made it real clear. Details are scattered, but what we know is this. Bugsy crossed into 112 Hoover territory again, mouthing off, throwing up his set. Maybe he thought he was untouchable. Maybe he thought they still wouldn't retaliate. But this time, Hoovers weren't in the mood to play. Gunshots rang out. Bugsy was hit, left in the street, no getaway, no last words. His death sent a message, not just to South Lost, but to everyone watching. The Hoovers were officially in it now. There were no more boundaries, no more second chances. If you banged the wrong way in the wrong spot, that could be it. And for South Lost, Bugsy wasn't just a member. He was a symbol. He was loud, visible, and unafraid. So when he got dropped, it wasn't just personal, it was war. From that moment forward, retaliation became routine. Hit after hit, shooting after shooting. This wasn't a quick beef that burned out. It was the start of a long, bloody feud that would leave bodies on both sides. By the early 90s, South Lost 13 was deep. Their numbers were up, their reputation was solid, and their confidence was high. They weren't just defending turf, they were on the offensive. With the Hoovers still recovering from multiple beefs, especially with Devil Lanes, the Hunteds, and Raymond Avenue Crips, South Lost saw an opening. They pressed hard. Every week, there were new stories. Hoovers getting jumped in traffic, corners getting sprayed, South Lost members boldly posted in Hoover blocks. They weren't moving quietly either. According to locals, they were cruising through Hoover areas in broad daylight, making their presence known. Cars got followed, windows got rolled down, glares turned into gunshots. This was daily life now. At the same time, the Hoovers were stretched. Their key members were either locked up, dead, or laying low. The heat was on from all sides. The Devil Lanes were still applying pressure. The Raymonds weren't letting up. And now, South Lost was trying to muscle in. It was too much. Some Hoovers started shifting north, closer to the 107th Hoovers. That's when the Cellos began to rise in prominence. But at this point in the war, South Lost had the upper hand. Still, dominance in the streets doesn't last forever. And one thing about gang wars, the moment you start slipping, your enemies smell it. The turning point would come soon. The Hoovers wouldn't stay weak for long. But for now, the early 90s belonged to South Lost 13 until they lost Lil Man. See, the streets remember how the war started, and eventually, so do the shooters. By the mid-1990s, the war had turned into something different. It wasn't just about respect anymore, it was personal. Every loss had to be answered. Every body dropped meant another retaliation. South Lost 13 had been dominant in the early part of the war. They were the ones pressing, making noise, claiming space. But in the streets, that kind of shine never lasts too long without consequences. The 112th Hoovers were getting tired of the losses, and with some of their older members out of the way, younger and more active ones started stepping up. Around this time, a shift started happening. South Lost began losing key members, some to prison, some to the grave. One of the major hits came when Lil Man, the same guy who started the whole war at that dice game back in '89, got killed. Details around his death aren't all clear, but most in the streets knew it was retaliation. His name had been sitting heavy on Hoover minds for years. When he got dropped, it was a signal. The Hoovers weren't done yet. Meanwhile, South Lost started pulling back a little. Not completely, but that aggressive energy from a few years earlier wasn't the same. They were still present, but the momentum was shifting. Some of their younger members didn't have the same drive or numbers. At the same time, the Hoovers were starting to regroup, especially with help from their allied sets like the 107 Hoovers, the Cellos. You could feel it in the neighborhoods. Fewer drive-bys from South Lost, more walk-ups from the Hoovers. The vibe was changing. Instead of being overpowered, the Hoovers were holding their ground. By '95 and '96, they were back in the mix, no longer just reacting, but making moves of their own. And that's when the Cellos started making their presence felt in a major way. The 107 Hoovers, better known on the streets as the Cellos, had always been close with the 112s. They weren't just neighbors, they were allies. When the 11 Deuce Hoovers were getting pressed from all sides, it was the Cellos who started stepping in heavier. By the early 2000s, they weren't just backing up the 112s, they were putting in their own work. The Cellos were younger, hungrier, and had something to prove. They weren't trying to let their OGs go out like that. They came into the war strong. A lot of reports from that time say the shootings picked up again, but this time it wasn't South Lost doing the pressing. It was the Cellos pulling up in South Lost territory, tagging walls, lighting up corners, making their name known. This was no longer just about old heads beefing from the '80s. The next generation was in it now. South Lost tried to respond, but it wasn't the same. Their numbers had already started thinning. Some of their key hitters were locked up, others had stepped away, and new enemies were showing up, making it harder to focus just on the Hoovers. The Cellos took full advantage. They treated the beef like it was theirs from the beginning. They slid through with walk-ups, not just drive-bys, face-to-face pressure. Their rep was going up fast. You had multiple incidents during this stretch where South Lost members were caught lacking, sometimes in their own hood, sometimes outside of it. Reports from the early 2000s talk about shootings that left both members and affiliates wounded or dead. And the Cellos weren't just active with South Lost. They were also dealing with other rivals, but they made sure South Lost felt it. By the time 2005 hit, the war had changed shape again. South Lost was no longer just fighting the 112 Hoovers. They were now dealing with the Cellos Rise. The dynamic flipped. Hoovers had been the underdog in the early years. Now they were putting South Lost on the defensive. Through it all, one thing was clear. This war wasn't cooling off. If anything, it was heating up in new ways. The names had changed. The faces were different, but the bodies were still dropping. And more sets were about to jump in, making things even more complicated. By the late 2000s, South Lost 13 wasn't just dealing with one or two sets anymore. They were under pressure from multiple directions. The 107th Hoovers, Cellos, had been steadily applying heat, but now they were teaming up with 18th Street, one of the largest and most established Latino gangs in Los Angeles. This wasn't a casual alliance. They had a shared enemy and weren't shy about joining forces. South Lost had their own history with 18th Street. The two sets had clashed before, but this time the stakes were different. With the Cellos back in the 112 Hoovers and now riding with 18th Street, it was a three-headed hit coming South Los's way, and it showed in the streets. Drive-bys turned into walk-ups. Spray tags got crossed out overnight. Corners that used to be neutral were now hot zones. Reports started coming in of coordinated attacks, especially around Imperial Highway in Vermont, key parts of South Lost turf. Word on the street was that South Lost members were getting caught slipping more often. Some incidents didn't even make the news, but locals knew it wasn't just about numbers, it was timing too. South Lost was already stretched. Years of war had thinned their ranks, and new recruits weren't coming in like before. The older heads were either locked up, dead, or off the radar. And the younger ones, they were facing pressure from the Cellos, 18th Street, and still had lingering issues with Devil Lanes. It was too much at once. Another wild card during this time was the 94 Hoovers. While not always in the headlines, their name popped up in certain incidents tied to this beef. South Lost couldn't catch a break. Every direction had eyes on them, and every corner felt like it could go left. And while the Hoovers and 18th Street weren't always on the same page in the broader gang landscape, when it came to targeting South Lost, the mission was aligned. The double team was enough. Adding in other enemies made survival even harder for South Lost. It wasn't just bodies being lost, it was turf, reputation, presence. South Lost 13 was becoming less visible on the streets they once controlled. The graffiti started disappearing, less activity during the day. Folks who used to rep openly now stayed quiet unless surrounded by their own. That fear was real, and the war wasn't done. Things hit a boiling point in August 2013. On the 21st, Hoovers made a move. A South Lost member was shot and left in critical condition. The next day, August 22nd, South Lost responded. Sergio, a known member of South Lost 13, reportedly borrowed a white SUV and drove it into Hoover territory. He wasn't alone. A silver car followed him, driven by Brianna, with her boyfriend, Carlos, also from South Lost, riding with her. Their destination was Colden and Vermont Avenue, a spot known to be Hoover territory. It was around 10 p.m. when things went down. A group of black residents, including Latasha, Trevor, and Maciel, were outside an apartment complex chilling with neighbors. That's when the SUV pulled up. According to statements, a gun appeared out the passenger window. Shots rang out. Maciel caught a bullet that grazed his head. Trevor got hit in the back and collapsed with a fatal wound. Latasha hit the ground and stayed down until the gunfire stopped. When she looked up, she saw the SUV speeding off. After the hit, Sergio ditched the SUV at a liquor store parking lot. Then he jumped into Brianna's car and disappeared into the night. It didn't take long for law enforcement to get on it. Deputies found the abandoned SUV and waited. Eventually, Naomi and a male companion returned to the vehicle. They were detained. Naomi later told detectives that she had loaned the SUV to Sergio. Less than a month later, on September 11th, LAPD set up surveillance on Imperial Highway to track Sergio. He was spotted near a gas station, headed toward a bus stop. When officers moved in, Sergio dipped. A foot chase broke out. One officer reported seeing Sergio with a stainless steel, semi-automatic handgun. He ran into a driveway, got cornered, and allegedly tossed the gun over a fence. Cops say he took up a fighting stance, fists raised. They tackled him and got him in cuffs. Back at the station, Sergio claimed he was at a Dodgers game the night of the shooting, but his alibi didn't hold up. Earlier that summer, he'd also been in a fight outside a liquor store with Hoover members. According to witnesses, 3 black males had jumped out shouting South Los and West Side Hoover, which led to a fight and a police response. What really sealed Sergio's fate was Brianna flipping. She ended up testifying against him. The evidence was heavy. Sergio was convicted of first-degree murder and resisting an executive officer. He got hit with a 210-year sentence. This incident was one of the last major known retaliations by South Los. After that, things slowed down. Not because peace was reached, but because South Los was running out of moves. Too many enemies, too many hits, and not enough bodies to keep the war going. The war didn't end in a treaty, it ended in silence. And silence on the street doesn't mean peace. It usually means someone lost the war. After 2013, it became clear that South Los 13 was no longer the same force it once was. The war had taken a toll, not just in lives, but in reputation, presence, and numbers. Years of non-stop beef, combined with arrests, internal fractures, and newer enemies, left South Los weakened. Where they once ran multiple blocks and held turf with authority, they now moved quieter, more cautiously. It wasn't just the Hoovers or 18th Street pressing them. South Los had stretched itself too thin. At different points, they were at odds with Devil Lanes, Broadway Crips, Gardena 13, and even had tension within parts of their own wider network. That kind of pressure chips away at any set over time. On the streets, people noticed the change. South Los members stopped being seen posted up like they used to be. Walls that used to be hit up with SXL13 tags were now either blank or marked by rival sets. You could walk certain blocks that used to be South Los territory and barely feel their presence. Some younger residents didn't even know South Los had once been dominant in that area. That's how far the influence had dropped. The Cellos, on the other hand, were still active. So were other Hoover sets. And in gang culture, once your presence fades, your rivals get louder. More tagging, more flexing in your old spots. That was the case through the mid and late 2010s. There were no official declarations, no press statements saying South Los was done. But on the streets, you could see it. When a gang that was once known for daily retaliation and constant activity starts falling quiet, that silence says everything. Even in prison yards, South Los wasn't commanding the same respect. Word spread quick in those spaces. If your set's not holding it down on the streets, you're not getting the same nods behind the walls either. By the time 2017 rolled around, some people described South Los as inactive. Not completely gone, but definitely not moving how they used to. Some of their members had flipped, others tried to rebrand, a few just faded out entirely. It was a long fall for a gang that once had numbers, reach, and respect in South Central. And part of that fall came from an old enemy that had never gone away. To really understand how South Los declined so hard, you have to look beyond just the Hoovers. Gardena 13 had beef with them dating back to the early 1970s. This wasn't a new problem, it was just one that got more violent over time. Gardena Trezetzi, or Gardena Trichi, is a Mexican-American gang based out of Gardena, California. Their turf stretches from 135th Street down to about 190 between Crenshaw and Main. That might seem a little far from the South Los heartland, but over the decades, paths crossed more than a few times. What made Gardena 13 dangerous for South Los wasn't just the usual hood beef. It was how calculated some of their moves were. Take August 10th, 2008, for example. That night, a big crowd, somewhere between 300 to 500 people, had gathered for a car show at Western and Imperial. Events like that always had mixed crowds, different sets, different cities, lots of posturing. That night, 3 South Los members showed up: Jose, his brother Victor, and a third named Vital. All 3 were making noise, repping their set loudly and throwing shade at the diversity of the crowd. It didn't take long. Gunfire broke out. Witnesses said a hail of bullets came from a dark-colored vehicle. The shots were aimed right where the South Los members were standing. Jose died at the scene. Victor and Vital were rushed to Harbor Medical, but both later died vital the next day. A 4th man was hit but survived. The shooter got away, but it didn't stay quiet. Word on the street was that Gardena 13 had orchestrated it. 3 years later, during a gang sweep, LAPD arrested a man named Luis, tied to Gardena 13. He was eventually convicted for the triple homicide and sentenced to 75 years to life, no parole. That shooting didn't just take out 3 South Lost members, it shook morale. The fact that it happened at such a public event with so many witnesses sent a message. Nobody was off limits, not even in a crowd of hundreds. This was another hit in a long line of setbacks for South Lost, at a time when they were already under fire from the Hoovers and dealing with pressure from other sets. This kind of ambush made things worse. Gardena 13's involvement also reminded everyone that South Los didn't just have black gangs coming after them. The Latino sets were just as active and sometimes even more strategic. Fast forward to the 2020s, and things look a lot different. South Lost 13 isn't completely gone, but they're far from what they used to be. The name still comes up in jail paperwork, police reports, and neighborhood talk. But on the street, their presence is minimal. You don't see them outside in force. Their turf's been reduced. And the newer generation, many don't even know the full story of who South Lost used to be. Meanwhile, the 107th Hoovers, the Cellos, are still very much active. Their beefs have shifted over time. These days, they're often mentioned in conflicts with sets like the Hundreds or Devil Lanes. The focus has moved. Same with Gardena 13. They still operate in their zone and have issues with multiple sets, but the South Lost War isn't a priority anymore. That battle's basically over. In the gang world, if you're not making noise, people move on, but the history stays. South Lost might not be deep in the streets today, but their story is still part of L.A.'s gang archive. They were a big part of the 80s and 90s landscape. They fought wars, gained turf, and lost it. Now, their name mostly pops up in retrospectives or in cases tied to older members. Some of those members are still locked up. A few got out and walked away from the life. Others didn't make it past 30. The South Central of today has new players. Some of the old names still carry weight, but the block is different. Cameras on poles, heavy police presence, social media beef replacing some of the old ways. And for some of the new heads, these old wars are just stories, things their uncles told them, things they heard in court or saw in documents, but that doesn't mean it's all in the past. In LA, a quiet set can always bounce back. All it takes is one new click, one young shot caller, and the cycle starts again. That's the part people forget. Sets don't always die. Sometimes they just go quiet until they're ready. For now though, South Lost 13's war with the Hoovers, it's mostly history, but history has a way of repeating itself when no one's paying attention. What are your thoughts on this story? Appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.